Welcome to People's University series on climate change. This is our fourth class. Tuesday, so we have all these things going on that are related to Wheeling Reeds, where the theme is kind of fossil fuels, climate change, that sort of thing. But on Tuesday the 5th, we're doing a panel discussion of a graphic novel called Here by Richard McGuire. And we'll be talking, it's about a room and what took place in the area that the room is in over hundreds of thousands of years. It includes everything you might imagine, from dinosaurs to fossil fuel extraction things. So that'll be Tuesday. And next Thursday, our final one of these, we'll have an 11-year-old young man named Zane Murray from Wheeling, who interviewed the attorney Robert Billet, who was portrayed by Mark Ruffalo in the film Dark Waters. And he'll actually be here as well via Zoom, the attorney, to talk to Zane, and we'll have him tell us what he did to fight against PFAS, which are the forever chemicals that are in our water. And also a young man named Edgar McGregor, who's a relative of Ellie, who isn't here tonight, but she works here in marketing. And he has like 44,000 Twitter followers because he does all this trash cleanup in California, and he's like internationally known. So he'll also be Zooming in next week. So that should be an inspirational program. And of course, on Saturday the 9th, we have the finale for Wheeling Reeds with 3 workshops and Jennifer Haig, who will be here. So I hope that a few of you can make that as well. Tonight, our class is called The Long, Slow, as you can see on the screen, The Long, Slow March of Progress Toward a Greener Future for West Virginia. Our instructor is Dr. Ember Morrissey, an Associate Professor of Environmental Microbiology at WVU. Her research focuses on soil microbial ecology, sustainable agriculture, environmental science, soil carbon sequestration, and global change ecology. I got through that. She received her BS in biology from the University of Maryland and her doctorate in Integrative Life Sciences at Virginia Commonwealth. So here is Dr. Ember Morrissey.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. So I'm happy to be here today and have the opportunity to talk to you about some of my understanding of West Virginia's past and where I think it might be going in the future. I want to qualify that I'm not an expert on everything I'm going to talk about today. I'm just sharing my understanding of how things have changed over time. And hopefully you can learn a thing or two as well. So I'm from Western Maryland originally, Cumberland, so I grew up in Appalachia and I love this part of the country. Feels like home to me. I think it's incredibly beautiful and rich in a million ways, and it's also incredibly rich in natural resources. So if you think about the history of West Virginia and how we have impacted the environment, I think that there's 3 main resources that are worth discussing. The first is lumber, and then coal, and then natural gas. Right? And these resources are abundant. All 3 of them are abundant in our state. And the way that they have been used over the last 150 years has really left a big impact on our environment. So if we start with lumber, before Western settlers arrived, West Virginia had 16 million acres of virgin forest. And this forest had trees that would be very hard for us to recognize compared to West Virginia's forests of today. So if you look, you notice in this picture, those are people down there that can help give you the scale of just how massive the trees in these forests were that grew over hundreds of years to get so large. And we also had species of trees that are no longer here for a variety of reasons, notably the presence of plant pathogens that came over with us from Europe. So between 1870 and 1920, there was a huge amount of logging that occurred. More than 30 billion board feet of lumber was produced in West Virginia. And just to give you a sense of how much that is enough lumber to build a 10-foot wide walkway that is 2 inches thick all the way to the moon. So it's just a huge amount of lumber. And needless to say, given that 99.9% of the forests in West Virginia were logged in just about a 50-year period, this was an environmental catastrophe. It's hard to really understand the full scope of it now because there weren't many people out there at the time measuring our environmental, like the quality of the streams and the effects on the soil. But we do know from historical accounts that after forests were clear cut, there were widespread fires. There was lots of soil erosion because whenever you cut down trees, the roots, normally in a forest, the roots help hold the soil in place. And as the trees get cut down and the roots start to die, that soil is then loose and free to move and washes into streams and rivers and really has a negative impact there. Also contributed to a lot of flooding. So this had a major impact that we, maybe don't think about as much today, but it's forever changed the forests of West Virginia. But that's not to say, that we're not in recovery. Over the most of the forests in West Virginia are now just about 100 years old, right? Because that's when 100 years ago is whenever the state was largely cut. And if you look at how forests look today, you can see that, so here we have small, medium, and large size classes of trees. And back in the 1960s, you had a lot of small and medium-sized trees. And then over the decades, the proportion of large trees has grown. So our forests are maturing, they are recovering, we are getting back to healthier forests, and that's great news. So I do think this is one area where I would argue that we've made a lot of progress over the last 150 years. And that's at least in part due to the fact that the Forest Service has come up with strategies to help protect our forest resources, including stewardship plans. And these stewardship plans have the goals of not totally eliminating logging, but having that be more sustainable. So not clear cutting huge areas, doing more selective logging, and keeping as much forest intact as possible to maintain habitat for wildlife and protect the quality of our soil and our water. Forests in West Virginia are also, if you saw Dr. Brostek's talk, you would know that they are our largest potential for natural carbon sequestration in the state. So this is a figure from an analysis that I helped work on out of WVU, where we looked at carbon dioxide removal technologies and natural processes. And in West Virginia, our forests naturally sequester a large amount of carbon, removing that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and keeping it in the soil and in the trees themselves. We could potentially even expand upon this with improved forest management to maximize the amount of carbon that's held in the trees and in the soil and forests. So there's a lot of opportunity to combat climate change by managing forests here in the state. Okay, so now I'm gonna switch gears a little bit and move from lumber to coal. So just about the same time that lumber and logging was slowing down, that's when coal was really ramping up. So it almost was like we went from one natural resource to another. The first mining in West Virginia is right here near Wheeling in 1810. But you can see in this graph that shows the amount of coal production in millions of tons per year over time. The coal production didn't really ramp up until just before the turn of the century. And that's because that's when the rail lines were completed that allowed the coal to be transported out to make its way to power plants. And this plot is showing you on the bottom, you can see the dots are the coal production, with black being coal production in the entire US, and the open circles are the coal production in Appalachia. And the vast majority of this coal production in Appalachia is from West Virginia for most of the 20th century. And that's largely because West Virginia is rich in coal, right? There are geologic formations that underlie most of the state. 53 out of the 55 counties in West Virginia have coal deposits. And it's relatively high value coal as well, so this medium and highly volatile coal. Early on, coal mining, as you're probably familiar, was very dangerous, and it was largely underground. The working conditions were harsh, there were a lot of accidents, and it caused health problems such as black lung. But what you might not remember is that in addition to affecting the air below ground, coal mining affected the air above ground whenever we burned it. So as coal became the dominant source of energy, it was the most common, and still is the most common source of energy in West Virginia. That burning that coal releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is of course a problem for climate change, but you also get other gases released, such as sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides. And these cause acid rain. So whenever sulfur dioxide gets up into the air, it reacts with water and forms sulfuric acid. This table is showing sources of acidity in rainfall from Ithaca, New York in 1975. So you might think like that's kind of far away, but it's very similar to what the whole East Coast experienced. And you can see the listed here are the different chemicals in the rain and their effect on the acidity. What you'll notice is this sulfuric acid, which is largely a result of the burning of coal that contained sulfur. It had the biggest effect on the acidity. And so it generally controlled the acidity in many industrialized areas, and it really reduced the pH of the rain. So if you look here, this is the 5-year mean pH between 1980 and 1984 in the eastern US. And you'll notice that right here in the Ohio Valley is really the most severe. I don't know if I can get this to work. The most severe in terms of acid rain. And that is, mirrors very closely what we see in the deposition of sulfur and nitrogen. And that's largely from the burning of coal that had a higher concentration of sulfur in it. Acid rain has a variety of negative environmental impacts. It impacts all sorts of animals. In this figure, it lists the sensitivity of different types of aquatic life to pH. And so this critical pH level is the level below which they can no longer survive. So if the rain is acidic, it's going to make the waterways more acidic, the lakes more acidic, and fish like bass and clams and crayfish are not going to be able to live in it anymore, which is obviously going to impact the whole ecosystem in a negative way. And because it's in the rain, it's affecting everywhere, right? It's having a really broad impact. It also negatively impacted forests and other plant species. So just as an example, here this is illustrating the effects of acid deposition on trees. And whenever acid is in the soil and interacts with the leaves, it leaches out calcium, and calcium is a very important nutrient for trees, and so it can cause them to have decreased cold tolerance or increased freezing injury. Acidic conditions also mobilize aluminum, which can be toxic to both plants and animals and humans. So obviously this acid rain was a big problem, and it's motivated the Clean Air Act to be passed in 1977, which required new coal plants to have equipment to remove sulfur in the smokestacks. And it also motivated coal companies to seek out low sulfur coal. The Clean Air Act was largely successful so this I would say is progress. So we have made progress in this regard. And you can see in these maps, this first one over here is 1990. There's still a high level. The red colors are showing the higher levels of sulfur deposition, which is going to be corresponding to the lower pH. You can still see a lot of that happening in 1990. This one is showing 2000. There's a lot less acid rain. And by 2007, it's looking a lot better, right? There's far less deposition of sulfur, far less acid in the rain, which is great. So we've made progress in getting our air cleaner, but the Clean Air Act had somewhat of an unintended consequence. It was partially the Clean Air Act and partially changes in the technology of coal mining, but as coal companies started looking for coal that was lower in sulfur, that coal tends to sit higher in mountains, higher in the formation. And that, along with changes in the technology, helped accelerate mountaintop removal mining. So high sulfur coal, most of this coal deeper down is higher in sulfur. And so after the Clean Air Act, companies didn't want to mine that anymore. Instead, they started mining up here. And so it made more sense to just clear the overburden rather than dig underground. And this is an interesting change, because in some ways it was an improvement for coal miners, because it's generally thought to be safer to work above ground. Still not entirely safe, but it's a little less hazardous. But I would argue that this is probably worse for the environment, right? Because to access coal through this method, everything above the coal seam is going to be blown off. They use high-powered explosives, giant machinery to remove all the soil and rocks. As I mentioned before, this had a big impact on mining jobs. So this figure is showing coal jobs over time. And you can see here on the x-axis, as time goes on, there's a peak in coal jobs. This is around the 40s, and then it starts to go down. once you get to, this is around the 90s, where we had the maximum activity of mountaintop removal mining. So the number of jobs went down, and the productivity per coal miner, that's the blue here, went up. So they needed less people, basically, when you were mining above ground with heavy machinery. And mountaintop coal mining, surface mining in general, but especially mountaintop mining, leaves huge scars on the landscape, as you can see here. So just to walk through a little bit of how it's done. So the first, this is what our mountain might look like to start out with. At first, the trees are going to be clear cut, and then they use explosive and massive machines to remove the earth. It's not moved all that far because it's usually just put, into valleys close by. It's called a valley fill, where you have these mining spoils. And then they extract the coal for a while. Once that is done, the site is reclaimed. And by that, I mean that it's smoothed out a little bit, and they try to stabilize some of the spoils, but you can see that the natural topology of the mountain is totally gone. And what's left, the soil here both on the surface and the spoils, because this is largely just rock, is going to be highly compromised. So mine soil does not function like a healthy soil typically does. And so this is a picture of Buck Lily Mine in Rupert, West Virginia. And you can see that this, we've got standing water on this site. And that's just an indication of the altered hydrology. So normally, if you have, in a normal forest, when it rains, the water's going to filter in through the soil, make its way slowly down to the creeks, and then move into the rivers. In these disturbed soils, they are often compacted, and the water doesn't move correctly, and so this can lead to problems like flash flooding, which is a common problem here in West Virginia. They also have low soil organic matter, low fertility. They can have poor texture, which makes it hard for plants to establish, heavy metals, acidity, so a whole host of problems that make these soils not as productive as they would have been before the mining activity, right? And in Appalachia, we have a fair amount of these, a relatively large amount of land that has been affected by surface mining. One potential use for this land is to grow bioenergy. So this figure here is showing an analysis of the renewable energy potential on marginal lands in the United States. And you can see that there's some areas that are really good for wind, some places are really good for solar, but here in a lot of the East, it seems like biomass production, particularly bioenergy crops, might be a really good way to use marginal lands to produce renewable energy. And that includes here in West Virginia. So some of the research that I have been working on in my lab is with Miscanthus ex giganteus, and this is sometimes called elephant grass. So it is a giant perennial grass that is able to grow in relatively harsh conditions, such as mine soil. So this is a picture of my graduate student, or she's now a postdoc, Jen Kane, who has done a lot of this work. And you can see just how tall this grass grows, up to 15 feet tall. So it produces a lot of biomass in a single growing season. And this biomass can be used for a variety of purposes. This illustration is showing that each year it takes up about 26 tons per hectare of carbon dioxide. So it's pulling in carbon dioxide from the air to grow. And then at the end of the growing season, that biomass can be harvested and used to produce electricity. Also, these bioenergy crops can be used to produce bioproducts, such as alternatives to cement. So you can make building materials and a variety of other products as well. So we study how plants and microbes interact to restore soil health on mined lands. So in the soil there are microbes including bacteria and mycorrhizal fungi. So mycorrhizal fungi are just fungi that interact with the roots of plants in a symbiotic way. And we understand, or we research how they help the plants be productive. And we've been studying these interactions on sites that have varying land use histories. So we've worked with a lower disturbance site that's not been impacted by mining, moderately disturbed site that is adjacent to mining, and then a highly disturbed site that has been directly surfaced mined. And we planted miscanthus on these soils in 2019, and the miscanthus is perennial, so it comes back every year, bigger and stronger, and so you can see here in 2019 it's just starting out, and then over time the biomass has increased dramatically. And as the biomass has established, we've been able to detect improvements in the health of the soil. So here I'm showing you bacterial richness, which is just the number of different species of bacteria we find in the soil over time. And as the miscanthus grows and puts more carbon and gets the roots established in the soil, we see a higher diversity of bacteria, which is an indicator of a healthier soil. We also see increases in the abundance of these mycorrhizal fungi over time as they start to colonize the soil to help the plants grow. In addition to measuring the microbial populations, we also measure how efficiently these populations use new carbon that's entering the soil. So as plants grow, they put sugars below ground out of their roots for the microbes, and then the microbes help them get nutrients to grow. And one of the ways that we measure microbial activity is by tracking how efficiently microbes can grow using sugar. And we call that the carbon use efficiency. So the carbon use efficiency of microbes in these soils increased over time, as did the amount of carbon in the soil and the amount of organic matter. So to put it all together, what we're seeing is that as the bioenergy crop grows, we get a more healthy and diverse microbial community in the soil that operates more efficiently, trapping more of that carbon coming into the soil and keeping it there, allowing the soil organic matter to accumulate over time. And that's really a good thing because it's restoring the health of the soil and it's trapping carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and that way it's combating climate change. And so I think that there's a case to be made that bioenergy could be a win-win for West Virginia, because it could be a productive use of these lands that are otherwise not very productive. So it's hard to grow, you can't grow traditional crops on them, but you can grow potentially these bioenergy crops. And at the same time, restore the soil health and improve the function of the ecosystem so that those things like hydrology are improved and you get more retention of water and less of that, like flash flooding and erosion. And it could be a carbon, potentially at least carbon neutral, but potentially even carbon negative source of energy if it stores more carbon in the soil over time. Okay. So I've talked a little bit about how mining impacts soil and the land, but it also has a big effect on streams. Here in this image, you can see these are from some mountaintop removal surface mines here in West Virginia, and streams are, as the overburden is moved, streams are often constructed, like you can see here, or contaminated. And so these streams don't function the way that they naturally have in the past. They have higher levels, so I forgot the axis on this one, but as the amount of contamination increases, you get increases in the amount of aluminum, iron, and other heavy metals in the stream as they become more acidic. Because essentially what happens is whenever pyrite is present in coal, and that leaches, again, sulfuric acid, the same problem that was in the rain. So you get the sulfuric acid, which makes the stream more acidic, which allows the heavy metals to remain dissolved, and ultimately ends up in a decrease in the concentration or decrease in the abundance of different types of animals. So here you see there's the stream water sulfate concentration, and this is showing the number of different types of insects and other aquatic animals in the streams. So mining impacted streams have less life. Sometimes they're totally dead, right? So that you find fewer insects, fewer mollusks, fewer fish, fewer salamanders. It's a very heavy impact. Thankfully, the amount of coal we're producing is finally going down. And so the negative impacts associated with mountaintop removal coal mining are decreasing as well because we're mining less coal. And that's in part because of the rise of natural gas that's happened over the last decade. So here you can see coal production is this blue line, and natural gas production here in yellow over time. And this is projected into the future. And that raises the question, all right, so it seems like we're switching our energy source, at least partially, from coal to natural gas. What are the impacts of natural gas drilling on streams? In my group, we did a project where we investigated this. So most of the natural gas production here in West Virginia, or in Appalachia in general, is what's called unconventional oil and gas. And so that's exactly what they're talking about in the book that you've been reading, if you've been reading Heat and Light. And it involves, what makes it unconventional is it involves this horizontal drilling. So instead of a vertical well, it comes down and then it goes sideways. And they put in a huge amount of fluid to break open the shale and release the gas. So fluid is injected underground through this horizontal drill, breaks open the shale, the natural gas comes back up. In addition to the gas coming back up, all that water, not all of it, but a lot of that water that was pumped down comes back up. And that water is no longer the same chemically as when it went in, because it picks up a lot of the chemistry of the shale formation. And so it comes back up very, very salty. And so it's what we call produced water. And it's hypersaline, which means that it's super salty, way more, it's like 100 times saltier than seawater. So it's like super salty. And it also contains relatively high concentrations of barium and strontium and even some radioactive chemicals. Natural gas is from the Marcellus Shale Formation, which you can see here is under the majority of the Appalachian Basin. And whenever wells are put in, it includes, in order to put in wells, there needs to be land alteration. So for each well pad, there's approximately 9 acres that are affected. So that's roughly 7 football fields. And there are a huge number of these across West Virginia. So this is a picture from 2015. It's the most recent one I could find. And every one of those little red dots is a gas well. So back in, I think it was 2019, we studied the effects of this activity on streams in West Virginia. And each one of these little blue dots represents one of the streams that we sampled. So we surveyed streams that experienced varying levels of this unconventional oil and gas activity in the watershed. We looked at 27 forested headwater streams in West Virginia 20 of them had oil and gas activity, had this fracking in the watershed, and 7 did not. And so from each stream, we collected sediment samples, biofilm samples. And so biofilms are just, the layer of algae and microbes that live on the surface of rocks in the stream bed. And we also collected water samples. We categorized these streams based on the level of oil and gas activity in the watershed using the acres of pipeline, the number of wells, and the land use classification using GIS information. And so we had the 7 wells that were, 7 streams that were not impacted by oil and gas, and then we had some around 10 that were impacted with below average development, and then 10 that were highly impacted with above average development. The good news is that we didn't find any evidence of stream water contamination with that produced water that comes out of the wells. So if you look at the chemistry of produced water that's shown in this table up here, the major ions in there are strontium and barium. So if there was contamination of streams with this water, we would expect to see elevated levels of those ions in stream water. And if we look at our data, we do not see a significant increase in strontium or barium in the impacted or highly impacted streams. And so that suggests that there isn't much, at least, of this produced water getting into the streams, which is the goal. The operators should be containing all of it and taking it off site. They actually sometimes when a well is finished producing gas and is no longer producing more gas, they'll put water back down it and store it back underground. That's, I think, the most common disposal method. People are trying to develop ways to clean that water, but it's very hard. So that's not to say that there were no impacts of the oil and gas activity on streams. We did find some relationships. Specifically, the acres of pipeline in the watershed was correlated with the amount of clay in the sediment. And that suggests to me that as the pipeline was put in, that disturbs the soil. And when soil is disturbed, fine particles like clay can wash into the watershed. And so I think that's what we're seeing in this is largely an effect of some erosion happening with the land disturbance associated with putting in the pipeline. We also saw differences in the microbial composition of the biofilms in the streams. So highly impacted and impacted streams had more cyanobacteria, so that's blue-green algae, and also other types of algae in the stream bed. And that, we think, is probably a result of deforestation and more light availability in the stream. So just as a little recap of what we found relating to the effects of unconventional oil and gas on streams, we found little evidence of changes in water chemistry, which is a good thing. We also found some increases in clay content and increases in algal abundance. So it seems like the effects of putting in these wells is similar to other types of land disturbance that you would see, for instance, with the development of, putting in other sorts of like houses or anything where you're just disturbing the land and deforesting. All right. So I know I've talked about a lot of things today, and it's challenging to determine, I've talked about a lot of environmental problems, and so it's like, are we really making progress, right? And I think that we have a long way to go. So if you look at the share of electricity generated from coal, that's over here. West Virginia is still among the highest, if not the highest, with regard to the share of our electricity that's generated from coal. And we have almost none of our electricity generated from renewables. So we do need to make some changes in order to be more sustainable in our energy sources. But I would argue that we have made progress. So for instance, with lumber, we now have enhanced forest stewardship. We're sequestering carbon from the atmosphere in our forests naturally, and we have the potential to have even greater carbon sequestration in forests with better management. In terms of coal, we have effectively removed enough sulfur from the coal so that we no longer have acid rain is no longer the problem that it once was, and it's also in decline. So coal mining is coal mining activity is a lot less than it used to be. And natural gas is obviously not ideal because we're still burning fossil fuels and we're still contributing to climate change. But I would argue that the environmental impacts of natural gas production are less severe than mountaintop removal coal mining and some of the other extractive industries that we've used in the past as a source of energy. So what's next for West Virginia's energy story? I really hope that we can, our next big source of energy will be something more sustainable like bioenergy crops. And that's basically all I have. I want to acknowledge two of my students, Jennifer Kane and Rachel Michaels, who did a lot of the work that I showed you today, and also some collaborators, Jeff Skousen and Lois McDonald. And with that, I'll take any questions.
A question about the grasses. Do you just do they die off in the wintertime, or are they cut, or what happens?
So they are warm season grasses, so they'll grow all summer and then be harvested in the fall, and they will re-sprout the next spring all by themselves. They're very low maintenance in terms of production. Yep.
So when they harvest them, what do they do with the grass?
The biomass, so right now we have not started utilizing it as much as we should in the United States. So right now a lot of biomass is being used for things like bedding, but eventually the goal is to build power plants that can directly use it for electricity generation. And that is happening in Europe. So now there are farmers that are growing bioenergy crops like miscanthus and actually shipping it across the Atlantic, which seems kind of inefficient. But we haven't installed the infrastructure to use them yet. But I'm hoping that we will get there.
Is it burned then?
Yes, it would be burned. And so it will release CO2, but that CO2 is offset by what it took in whenever it grew. So it makes it carbon neutral unless you count what it puts underground. And because miscanthus puts so much carbon underground, even when you burn it, there's still more carbon removed than released back. If that makes sense. If you don't cut it, it'll just grow back again. You'll just accumulate a huge litter layer of dead grass above your soil, which is that stores carbon as well.
Did you say they make like a cement kind of thing?
Yeah, people are exploring making all kinds of different products from the biomass.
I'd like to know why the gas drilling can go sideways instead of straight in.
That is a question for an engineer. Sorry, I can't help you there. I don't know why it can, but I know why they do it that way.
Why?
They do it that way to fracture more of the shale. So the shale formations run horizontally, kind of like coal formations. And so if you're going straight up and down, you're not going to be accessing as much of it. Whereas if you put in a long horizontal pipe, which releases the liquid out to the sides, it breaks open more of the shale in that formation to release the gas.
I thought it was just to avoid the landowners' issues. But
I don't think so.
gas form or is it liquid form that it comes up?
So after the so they put down what's called, they call it fracking fluid. There's different terms for it, but they put down what's essentially water with some couple of added chemicals to help it break things apart. And then initially, a lot of that water will come back up. Eventually, water is going to stop coming and it's just going to be gas. Yeah, it's just natural gas, yeah. So methane, it's just going to be a bunch of methane coming out of the well. You'll still get like little amounts of produced water coming up, but the vast majority of it's just gas after the initial process. Yeah?
So is elephant grass a Native American species, or is it from somewhere else in the world? And what are the applications for the environment that is here?
Okay, so it is a naturally occurring sterile hybrid between two species. And so that means that there are two species of grass that cross with each other and produce this giant grass, but this does not actually produce its own seeds that are sterile. So it's propagated by the roots, which makes it a little bit harder to plant. But it has the benefit of it's never going to be invasive because it can't spread on its own. So it's actually not native to the United States, it's native to China. But because it's a sterile hybrid, it can't, it's not going to become an invasive species.
It can't take over an environment.
That's right. It's not going to take over anywhere farther than like a meter away from where you planted it.
When I think about the Inflation Reduction Act, some of the pieces in there as far as reclamation funding, how receptive has, I guess it doesn't matter how receptive they are, the coal companies when they go to reclaim the land, what practices they will allow for instances like this where you can grow the bioenergy grasses into that reclamation plan, I guess.
I'm not super familiar with.
Yeah, I wonder how that would be a good joining factor, like, as part of the reclamation package of this set of lands need to be done with, can we use bioenergy to do the same and bring that back? I
think it would be.
Yeah.
And I know that there are some, so we have an extension specialist at WVU who has worked with some coal companies to plant miscanthus on their reclaimed lands, but I don't know how prevalent that's likely to be with the new policies.
And I was also thinking on the opposite side of that, when you have people who are upset about seeing large swaths of land being occupied by solar arrays and solar farming, where this type of bioenergy or biograss fit in as well in those areas, and not only reduce the carbon load that's being pulled out of the air, but also being there solar arrays.
Yeah.
So
Are all the miscanthus fields research facilities at this point, or are there some actual reclamation projects that have moved in?
There are some reclamation projects in existence. So there are a couple of reclaimed mine lands in West Virginia that I know of, and at least one in Ohio that have miscanthus planted on them for reclamation purposes. I don't think that it's super widespread at this point, but hopefully as we, if we can get more momentum to transition over to renewable energy, it will become more common.
So is there research about the effects on wildlife of miscanthus growth that we not know yet?
I think that there is some research out there, but I'm not super familiar with it.
It seems like where they planted it would kill and improve it.
It's really good for the soil. The question is whether it's better than trying to plant, for instance, well, on reclaimed mine lands, it's not really much of an option, but there's a debate out there about whether we should be planting native species for bioenergy, because there are some, switchgrass, for instance, is an option that is native and can be used for bioenergy. It's not as productive as miscanthus, so that's would be the downside. But it might be better for like the insect populations. But miscanthus performs very well on these incredibly poor soils, so I think that it has a definite role to play. But I think we should explore all the above. Yeah.
Is there a toxicity involved in the burning? I mean, is there something that it is leaving behind that is not so good, or
I don't think so. I think that,
it's like burning the law?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Is it edible? Could a cow eat it?
No, cows don't want to eat it. Deer don't eat it, which is a good thing if you're trying to grow it and sell it.
Yeah, one more question. From the side of hydrogen for electricity production, is there a biofuel application as far as liquid fuel?
So people are working on that, and it's my understanding that the goal, that scientists are working on trying to convert it into liquid fuel, but it's still really, it can be done, but it's really expensive, and so it's not competitive with other, liquid fuels at the moment. But there's a lot of research happening on it, yeah.